On a scorching August day in 1971, a 21-month-old girl disappeared without a trace from her home in Fort Worth, Texas. There were no witnesses, no ransom note, no clues left behind. For 51 years, the little girl's name, Melissa Highsmith, lingered on missing child posters, in database entries, and in the prayers of a family that refused to forget. A mystery older than many of the detectives who would inherit the case, it seemed destined to remain unsolved. But when the truth finally emerged in 2022, it shattered every assumption about time, distance, and fate. Incredibly, the child everyone had searched for across the country had been nearby all along, hiding in plain sight. Before we unspool this case minute by minute, tap like, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe to Cold Case Desk so you never miss a breakthrough in the world's coldest cases. Summer 1971 was sweltering in Fort Worth. The city's working-class neighborhoods bustled with families striving to make ends meet. Among them was 22-year-old Alta Apantenko, a young mother doing her best to raise her toddler daughter Melissa on her own. Alta had recently separated from Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, and worked long hours as a waitress to support herself and her child. She shared a small apartment with a roommate, juggling double shifts at the restaurant to keep the bills paid. Reliable childcare was hard to find and even harder to afford. Desperate for help, Alta turned to a common solution at the time, a classified ad in the local paper. In the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Alta placed a brief advertisement seeking a babysitter for weekday care. It was a routine request, one made by countless parents in that era, and she hoped it might connect her with someone trustworthy to watch Melissa while she worked. She could never have imagined that this ordinary act would set in motion one of the longest-running missing child cases in American history. A few days after the ad ran, Alta received a phone call. The woman on the line introduced herself as Ruth Johnson. She spoke softly and confidently, explaining that she had years of experience caring for children. Ruth described living in a nice home with a big yard, an ideal environment for a little girl. Her tone was polite, professional, even reassuring. Alta was hopeful. They arranged to meet in person at the restaurant where Alta worked so she could interview this potential babysitter. But on the agreed day, Ruth didn't show up. Instead, she called with an apology, citing a last-minute conflict, and expressed continued interest in the job. Her persistence and calm demeanor eased Alta's concerns. Pressed her tightening work schedule, and with no family nearby to help, Alta made a fateful decision. She hired Ruth Johnson over the phone, sight unseen. At the time, it seemed like a practical solution to a common problem. On the morning of August 23, 1971, Alta left for work early as usual. The plan was for Alta's roommate to hand off little Melissa to the new babysitter a bit later that morning. Around 9 a.m., a woman arrived at the Spanish Gate Apartments on East Seminary Drive, where Alta lived. The roommate greeted her, noting that the visitor matched Alta's description of Ruth Johnson. She was a woman of composed demeanor, neatly dressed, and confident in her movements and speech. Yet, something about her appearance was odd given the blistering Texas heat that day. Temperatures were soaring above 100 Fahrenheit. Despite the swelter, the woman was overdressed from head to toe. She wore long white gloves that ran up her forearms. A scarf was tied snugly around her neck, and a bonnet or large head covering hid her hair and shaded much of her face. Her outfit was clean and formal, almost as if she were dressed for a Sunday church service rather than a morning of babysitting. The roommate found it strange. Who wears layers and gloves in August? But the woman's gentle manner put her somewhat at ease. Ruth Johnson, as she introduced herself, spoke kindly and appeared completely composed despite her heavy clothing. Trusting the arrangements Alta had made, the roommate didn't question the eccentric attire. She handed Melissa to the woman, along with a diaper bag containing the toddler's essentials: a bottle, fresh diapers, a change of clothes. The exchange was brief, just a few minutes on the apartment doorstep. The woman thanked the roommate politely, settled little Melissa on her hip, and walked away from the apartment carrying the 21-month-old child. She vanished down the sidewalk and around a corner. That was the last time anyone from Melissa's family saw the woman in white gloves, or Melissa. That evening, Alta returned home from work expecting to find her daughter safe, perhaps napping or playing with the babysitter. Instead, she walked into a silent apartment. Melissa wasn't in her crib. Her toys lay undisturbed, her bottle still full on the counter. At first, Alta thought there must have been a simple mix-up. Maybe the babysitter had taken Melissa out for a little walk or back to her own house for a bit. But as the minutes ticked by with no word, that hopeful assumption gave way to dread. Alta called around to neighbors in the complex, asking if anyone had seen a woman with a small child, or if the babysitter mentioned an errand or delay. No one had seen or heard anything. By nightfall, that dread had spiraled into panic. Shortly after 8 p.m., Alta picked up the phone and dialed the Fort Worth Police Department to report her daughter missing. Officers arrived at the apartment and immediately began their investigation. They took statements from Alta and her roommate, trying to piece together every detail of the day. The description of the babysitter, a well-dressed woman obscuring her identity with gloves and a scarf on a brutally hot day, struck the police as deeply troubling. They quickly checked local records for anyone named Ruth Johnson fitting that description. Nothing. No such person seemed to exist in the area under that name. The roommate's account became the sole lead. A polite, soft-spoken woman, oddly overdressed, claiming to be Ruth Johnson. Investigators recognized the hallmarks of a disguise. The long gloves might have been worn to ensure no fingerprints were left behind. The bonnet and scarf could hide hair color, style, distinguishing marks, even part of her face. The outfit now looked less like quirky fashion and more like calculated concealment. It was clear to the officers that this stranger had gone to great lengths to prevent anyone from identifying her. That night and over the next days, police canvassed the area around the apartment complex. They knocked on doors, showed Melissa's photograph, and asked residents if they had noticed a woman carrying a toddler at any point on August 23rd. Not a single neighbor recalled seeing anything unusual. Detectives visited nearby shops and restaurants, questioning employees if they had seen a woman with a young child, but no sightings were reported. They checked with local transit, bus drivers, taxi companies to see if a woman and a little girl had boarded a bus or hailed a cab. Again, nothing. Hospitals and clinics in the region were alerted in case a child fitting Melissa's description was brought in. They came up empty-handed. Officers even searched the surrounding terrain, wooded lots, alleys, ditches near the freeway, for any trace of the child's belongings or clothing. There was no physical evidence anywhere. It was as if Melissa and the woman had evaporated into the hot Texas air. By the second day of the investigation, the situation was dire enough that the FBI became involved. The federal agents classified Melissa's disappearance as a likely kidnapping under the Federal Kidnapping Act, which gave them jurisdiction, especially if there was a chance she'd been taken across state lines. Wanted posters and missing child flyers with Melissa's sweet-faced photo were distributed across Texas and into neighboring states. Newspapers picked up the story, and headlines in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and other papers blared "Missing Fort Worth Toddler" alongside Melissa's picture. Television news ran segments showing Alta, heartbroken and teary-eyed, pleading for her daughter's safe return. Despite the flurry of initial activity, investigators soon ran into the harsh realities of the era. This was 1971. There were no surveillance cameras on street corners or in stores, no internet to spread information instantly, no credit card records to trace, and of course no cell phones to ping locations. The mysterious babysitter had arranged everything via anonymous phone calls, likely made from public payphones, so there was no phone number or address to trace. Every investigative avenue relied on human memory and legwork, and memories are imperfect at best. The trail was already growing cold. As is standard in cases of missing children, police also cast a critical eye on the family and those close to the child. Alta was questioned over and over about her acquaintances, her estranged husband, and any possible reason someone she knew might take Melissa. Investigators briefly considered whether Jeffrey Highsmith, Melissa's father, or another relative could have been involved. Perhaps a custody dispute or some retaliation. But nothing in Alta's or Jeffrey's backgrounds suggested they were anything but devastated parents. They had separated, yes, but there was no acrimony severe enough to suggest a staged abduction. Both Alta and Jeffrey were quickly cleared. Each had solid alibis, and there was simply no evidence pointing to them. This truly looked like the work of an outsider, a stranger abduction, which was and is one of the most difficult types of cases to solve. In those first frantic days, the community rallied. Volunteers organized search parties that scoured vacant lots, fields, and parks for any sign of the toddler. Dozens of people answered the call, walking shoulder to shoulder through tall grass and brush, hoping to spot a discarded clue, perhaps the little bow that Melissa wore in her hair, or a piece of the clothing she'd been dressed in. They found nothing. Local churches held prayer vigils, and families in Fort Worth went to bed with their doors locked tightly, horrified by the notion that a kidnapper had struck in their midst. Yet no credible witnesses ever came forward. Not one person reported, "I saw a woman with a child that morning who looked distressed," or "I remember a lady in a bonnet carrying a baby." The investigation, thorough as it was, had almost no leads to pursue beyond the babysitter's phony name and concealed appearance. Police records from the time note how quickly each promising angle hit a dead end. By week's end, the reality was sinking in. This kidnapper had executed her plan with chilling precision, and there was nothing for investigators to grab onto. Inside the police department, frustration was mounting. Seasoned detectives privately admitted they had never encountered a case with so little evidence. A woman had walked into a family's life, taken a child, and vanished without leaving a single trace of herself behind. The simplicity and completeness of the crime was haunting. As one detective noted in his report, the only certainty was that the abduction had been carefully planned. Whoever Ruth Johnson really was, she had likely been stalking the classifieds for a vulnerable situation, had possibly watched Alta's routine and prepared her disguise and exit strategy in advance. It was the kind of methodical operation that, at the time, police had little technical ability to unravel. For Alta, those first days were agonizing and surreal. One moment she was a mother juggling work and childcare, the next she was living every parent's nightmare. After Melissa's disappearance, Alta quit her job, at least temporarily, to devote herself entirely to the search for her daughter. She spent her days at police headquarters answering questions, poring over maps with investigators, and making lists of anyone she could think of who might have had a hand in this. There was nobody obvious. At home, she found herself wandering through the apartment, searching the same corners and closets over and over, as if Melissa might somehow reappear there. Nights were the worst. Alta lay in bed replaying every detail of her interactions with the mysterious babysitter, the wording of the newspaper ad, the sound of the woman's voice on the phone, the phrases "large yard" and "experienced babysitter" that had sounded so reassuring at the time. Each memory now felt like a trap she had walked into. She second-guessed every choice. What if she had insisted on meeting in person? What if she hadn't been so trusting? An unbearable loop of what-ifs kept sleep far away. Eventually, as summer turned to fall with no breakthroughs, the Fort Worth Police Department had to scale back the active search. There were no suspects to pursue, no crime scene to analyze. Leads had been exhausted. The case was transferred from the Homicide Kidnapping Division to the Missing Persons Bureau, a sign that it was moving into long-term limbo. Officially, Melissa Highsmith's case remained open, but without new information, it was effectively dormant. Her file joined dozens of other unsolved cases in a metal cabinet, awaiting the day when someone might come forward or a piece of evidence might surface. As 1971 drew to a close, the story of the missing Fort Worth toddler that once dominated front pages slipped into the background. Newspapers moved on to other news, and Melissa's photograph, bright eyes, chubby cheeks, a tiny bow in her hair, faded from current events into memory. But the clarity of that initial tragedy remained stamped in everyone's minds. A scorching hot morning, a polite stranger in immaculate gloves, and a single moment of trust that had shattered a family's world. The image of the woman in white gloves carrying Melissa away became an enduring nightmare, a symbol of how an ordinary day can turn extraordinary and tragic in an instant. That unknown woman had stolen more than a child. She had stolen the family's sense of safety and certainty, leaving behind decades of pain and questions that no one could answer. By the end of that year, Melissa Highsmith's name had been added to a growing list of missing children in America. The early 1970s saw rising awareness of child abductions, but the tools to investigate them were still primitive. Melissa's case stood out for its utter lack of clues and for the cruel trick that set it in motion. It began not in violence or chaos, but in a young mother's trust in a stranger who seemed kind, trust that was betrayed in the most devastating way. And as completely as the mysterious woman had materialized, she was gone, along with the little girl Alta had loved more than anything. When a child goes missing, every minute counts. Police working Melissa's case in August 1971 knew that if they didn't find a lead within the first 48 hours, their chances of locating the child would plummet. Those first 2 days came and went, with no sign of Melissa. Then a week passed, then a month. As summer turned to winter, the painful truth set in. Melissa was gone, and no one knew if she would ever be found. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Before long, Melissa Highsmith's disappearance was not just a current investigation, it was a cold case. Despite the initial flurry of effort by Fort Worth police and the FBI, progress had stalled almost immediately. There was no ransom demand. Ransom kidnappings were more typical if money was the motive. No evidence pointing to a relative or estranged spouse, the usual suspects in toddler abductions, and nothing concrete to indicate a wider kidnapping ring at work. The lack of any discernible pattern or clue became the case's defining feature. Investigators were left theorizing in a vacuum. Early on, they concluded that this kidnapping had to be premeditated. The elaborate disguise and smooth execution made that clear. But without a suspect name or description beyond mystery woman in gloves, they were chasing ghosts. Whoever abducted Melissa had managed to leave no paper trail, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. She was, for all practical purposes, a phantom. Alta, of course, remained under a cloud of scrutiny for some time. In child disappearances, investigators often start with those closest to the child to rule out an inside job. But with each passing interview, it became obvious that Alta was a heartbroken mother, not a culprit. There was no secret plan to send Melissa away, no insurance scheme, no estranged lover with a vendetta. Alta's entire life became defined by waiting for police updates, enduring rounds of interrogations designed to probe whether she knew more than she was saying she didn't, and facing the accusatory question no mother ever wants to hear: did you have something to do with it? Investigators ultimately found nothing to implicate Alta or anyone in the Highsmith family. It truly appeared a random predator had struck. Still, Alta's torment was ceaseless. Each morning she woke up to the echoing absence of her daughter, and each night she fell asleep, clutching the hope that tomorrow might bring news. She kept a cherished photograph of baby Melissa by her bedside and would often gaze at it, tears in her eyes, mentally transporting herself back to that innocent time before all of this happened. She recounted to herself the chain of events over and over like a tragic mantra. The classified ad, the friendly phone calls, the decision to trust a stranger. She agonized, wondering if she had missed some warning sign, some tell in the woman's voice or words that could have tipped her off. But there was nothing obvious. Alta had been deceived by an apparently well-rehearsed lie. Meanwhile, the FBI maintained an open case file. Because there was no proof that Melissa had been taken across state lines, the federal role was limited, but agents periodically checked in on the case. They kept Melissa's information active in the National Database for Missing Persons. However, by the mid-1970s, as months turned to several years, new cases crowded out the old. The 1970s saw a troubling number of high-profile child abductions nationwide, and sadly, Melissa's case slid into the backdrop of the pre-digital era backlog. Leads were few and far between, and any new tip that did come in often led investigators down a dead end. Yet for all the procedural stagnation, the Highsmith family's search never truly stopped. Alta and Jeffrey, though no longer together as a couple, were forever bound by the loss of their first child. They each tried to carry on with life, work, possibly new relationships and even additional children in the years to come. But the question of Melissa's fate was a constant undercurrent. Neither time nor even remarriage could erase the shared pain of not knowing what happened to their little girl. Over the next 5 decades, Alta, Jeffrey, and later their children, Melissa's younger siblings, born after her disappearance, chased every glimmer of hope, every rumor and whisper about a girl who might be Melissa. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the issue of missing children gained more national attention. By the early 80s, images of missing kids started appearing on milk cartons and in public service announcements. People were becoming more aware, and organizations were forming to address these tragedies. New technology began to trickle into investigations as well. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement agencies and non-profits could create age-progressed sketches. Artists or computer programs would approximate what a missing child might look like years later. The Highsmiths took advantage of any tool available. They provided Melissa's photos to the newly established National Center for Missing Exploited Children, NCMEC. In return, NCMEC produced illustrations showing how Melissa might appear as she aged, first as a grade school kid, then as a teenager, and later as a grown woman in her 20s. Alta and her family circulated these images far and wide. Pamphlets with Melissa's story and these age-progressed pictures were mailed out and handed around. Local news would occasionally run human interest stories. "Have you seen this girl?" Segments reminding the public that Melissa was still missing and showing viewers the artist's latest guess at her appearance. Each time, tips would trickle in, and each time, those tips led to heartbreak. Leads came in from all over the country. A woman in rural Oklahoma once contacted the family, convinced that her new neighbor bore an uncanny resemblance to the most recent sketch of Melissa. With hearts racing, the Highsmiths followed up, only to find that the neighbor's background could be clearly traced. She was not Melissa. Another time, a long-haul truck driver in New Mexico reached out claiming he had given a ride to a hitchhiker in her 20s who had the same first name and general look as the missing Fort Worth girl. Again, the family sprang into action, and again, it was a dead end. The young woman in question was found, but she had no connection to Melissa's case. Still, Alta and Jeffrey persisted. They would drive hundreds of miles on a moment's notice to check out a possible sighting or meet someone who claimed to have information. With each trip, they learned to temper their optimism. Experience had taught them a cruel paradox. Hope was their lifeline, but it could also be a punishment when it was dashed time and again. Every time a new lead surfaced, the entire family would ride a roller coaster of emotions, tentative excitement, anxious waiting, then crushing disappointment. It was emotionally exhausting, but they felt they owed it to Melissa to pursue everything, no matter how far-fetched. By the 1990s, a new scientific tool began to appear in criminal investigations: DNA testing. At first, DNA was primarily used to solve violent crimes or identify remains, but the Highsmiths were quick to ask if it could help find Melissa. In those early years, however, DNA databases were rudimentary and largely focused on criminal offenders. Alta and her family provided their own DNA to various organizations and law enforcement, hoping that if any unidentified children or Jane Does were found, they could be compared to their profiles. But it was a shot in the dark. The technology was in its infancy. Databases were not interconnected or comprehensive, and nothing turned up a match. Each DNA test result came back with the same disheartening word: negative. Despite the lack of answers, Alta refused to use the word closure. She could not declare an end to the search or mourn Melissa as gone without definitive proof. Not knowing kept her going. As the 1990s waned, public interest in the decades-old case waned with it. News media are drawn to developments, and Melissa's story simply had none. By then, Fort Worth's police department was grappling with a heavy load of cold cases. It got to the point that one detective was assigned over 1,000 unsolved cases, a nearly impossible task that meant many files, including Melissa's, gathered dust unless a new tip fell directly into their laps. At the dawn of the new millennium, the Highsmith family found a fresh avenue for their quest: the Internet. In the early 2000s, social networks and online forums began connecting people in new ways. Melissa's younger siblings, who had grown up hearing about their missing sister, and witnessing their parents' tireless efforts took the lead. Around 2008, they created a Facebook page titled Finding Melissa Highsmith. It served as both a digital archive of everything known about the case and a public call to action. They posted every photograph they had of baby Melissa, scans of old newspaper articles about the kidnapping, and the series of age-progressed images that had been made over the years. The page told the story to anyone who would listen: a beloved baby sister stolen away, a family that never gave up hope, and a question still awaiting an answer. Through social media and the burgeoning true crime community online, Melissa's story slowly gained new visibility. Local people who had never heard of the case stumbled upon the Facebook page and shared it. Advocacy groups for missing children connected with the Highsmiths. Armchair detectives on forums like Web Sleuths began dissecting the case, re-examining every known detail. The cryptic Ruth Johnson alias, the white gloves and bonnet disguise, the lack of any follow-up sightings. They shared theories, however speculative, about what might have happened. Some wondered if the kidnapper could have been someone who desperately wanted a child of her own. Others thought it could have been an illegal adoption scheme. But despite the renewed conversation, concrete answers remained elusive. Every few years, the case would resurface briefly in the media, often prompted by a new age progression image or a significant anniversary of the disappearance. The family and their supporters would use these moments to generate tips. Occasionally, a self-identified Melissa would contact the Highsmiths, suspecting that she might be the missing woman due to gaps in her own past or inconsistencies in her childhood records. Each time, the Highsmiths approached it with cautious optimism, and each time DNA tests would dash their hopes. False alarms like these were a double-edged sword. They strengthened the Highsmiths' resolve to keep searching, but they also reopened wounds with each disappointment. For Alta, these cycles of hope and heartbreak were emotionally draining beyond description. She learned to steel herself when opening emails with DNA results or answering late-night phone calls that might be from a detective or a stranger claiming to have information. Every time the phone rang, I thought, maybe this is it, she once recounted, and then it wasn't. Still, nothing could make her give up. How could she? Her daughter was out there somewhere. She had to be. Alta often said she would rather ride the painful highs and lows of uncertainty than accept a future without her child. As the years stretched on, some in the community grew critical of law enforcement's inability to crack the case. Local newspapers occasionally ran editorials asking how such a personal, high-profile mystery could languish for so long without resolution. Cold case activists pointed out that families like the Highsmiths were essentially doing the investigative legwork themselves, keeping the search alive while official efforts dwindled. Under pressure, the Fort Worth police did what they could, but their resources were stretched thin. One department spokesperson candidly admitted, "We can't give each case the attention it deserves." It wasn't an excuse so much as a sobering fact of limited manpower and overwhelming caseloads. Yet, in the absence of clear progress from authorities, the Highsmith family's unwavering dedication turned Melissa's story into a quiet symbol of enduring hope. Every year, they held a birthday celebration for Melissa, even though she wasn't there to blow out the candles. On Melissa's would-be 10th birthday, then 20th, 30th, 40th, family and close friends gathered around a cake. They would light a single candle and speak the wish that lived in their hearts. "We'll bring you home." Alta kept up this tradition year after year, even when some people gently suggested that it might be time to move on or let go. She simply couldn't. Neighbors would see Alta every November placing a candle in the window, its small flame flickering through the night. When asked how she could continue this after so many years, Alta's answer was straightforward and unwavering. "Because I haven't seen her with my own eyes, and until I do, she's not gone." Over time, as Alta grew older, the responsibility and drive to continue the search passed increasingly to Melissa's siblings. They never had the chance to know their sister, but they had grown up under the shadow of her absence and the ache it left in their family. In their adulthood, they took up the mantle, maintaining the social media pages, reaching out to non-profit organizations, filing freedom of information requests to get any records that might shed new light, and staying in touch with detectives who rotated through the cold case unit. They educated themselves on the latest in investigative techniques, from how to navigate public records to how to use genetic DNA matching services. If there was even a slim chance of finding their sister, they were determined to chase it. However, the blunt reality was that with each passing decade, the odds of a happy reunion grew slimmer. Most infant abductions from the early 1970s, if they were ever solved at all, didn't end with the child found alive 5 or 6 decades later. More often, such cases ended in tragedy or simply faded into permanent mystery. Some family members privately feared that Melissa might have passed away long ago, her fate never known, or that the kidnapper had taken the secret to the grave. In darker moments, one might wonder if Melissa herself even knew she was Melissa. Perhaps she had been raised under a different name, entirely unaware that she was a missing person. The questions were endless and the answers few. Despite occasional bouts of doubt, the Highsmiths rejected giving in to despair. They believed that as long as they were alive, there was hope to find Melissa alive too. In the late 2010s, a revolutionary approach to solving cold cases began to emerge: genetic genealogy. This technique had famously been used to crack the identity of the Golden State Killer, among others, by tracing DNA from crime scenes to distant relatives in public genealogy databases. The Highsmith family paid close attention to these developments. If DNA could help identify an unknown criminal or the remains of a Jane Doe, maybe, just maybe, it could help find a living person like Melissa by connecting family DNA to hers indirectly. All the while, Alta's faith remained steady and sincere. By 2021, 50 years had come and gone since she last saw her baby. Alta's hair was grey, her face lined with the passage of time and the weight of sorrow, but her resolve was as strong as ever. To outsiders, her hope might have seemed puzzling or even delusional, but to Alta, it was the only way to live. When asked in an interview how she managed to still believe after a half-century, Alta explained that hope wasn't a choice, it was survival. "If I stop believing she's alive," Alta said softly, "then I lose her twice." In other words, giving up hope would be like losing Melissa all over again, and that was something she refused to do. Publicly, Melissa's story would flare back into the headlines occasionally and then recede, but privately, it was the constant backdrop of the Highsmiths' lives. It influenced every decision, every holiday, every family gathering, always that empty chair, that missing piece. Fort Worth moved into the 21st century, becoming a modern city with new highways and gleaming buildings, and archives turning digital. But in a hallway of the Fort Worth Police Department, one thing remained frozen in time: a fading photograph thumbtacked to the cold case bulletin board, showing a smiling toddler in a white dress circa 1971. A tangible reminder that the case was still open, if only in name. Detectives over the years dutifully re-examined the file whenever a tip came in or when reviewing cold cases in general. They confirmed that all the original evidence, what little existed, had been preserved, yet nothing new ever jumped out. Melissa Highsmith's disappearance stood as one of Texas's oldest unsolved child abductions. For the police, it was a stubborn, painful mystery, a case that defied closure. For the Highsmith family, it was an open wound that refused to heal, sustained by a faith that one day somehow an answer would come. By the time 2022 arrived, 51 years had elapsed since that August morning. The world had transformed in almost every conceivable way. Technology, policing methods, and communications were light years ahead of where they'd been in 1971. Tasks that once took days, like checking records or sending out flyers, could now be done in seconds with a computer. Yet the same haunting question loomed unanswered. Where was Melissa? How could a toddler vanish off the face of the earth in such a thorough way? It seemed improbable that any new lead would emerge after so long. And indeed, the answer, when it finally did come, did not emerge from a detective's notebook or a long-forgotten tip. It came from a place no one in 1971 could have even imagined: a few drops of saliva and a string of genetic code uploaded to a public website by a father who simply refused to stop searching for his child. By early 2022, Melissa Highsmith's case was among the oldest active missing person cases in the country. For many families, such a story would have quietly faded into time, mentioned only on anniversaries or in hushed family lore. But the Highsmiths' relentless efforts, especially their use of social media, had kept Melissa's memory very much alive. On the finding, Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, followers continued to share posts and send in words of encouragement. Tips still trickled in occasionally from every corner of the country. Most were long shots or well-intentioned guesses, but one tip in September 2022 caught everyone's attention in a new way. An anonymous caller contacted the National Center for Missing Exploited Children, NCMX, with a startling claim. They had seen a woman in Charleston, South Carolina, who bore a strong resemblance to one of the age-progressed images of Melissa. The caller didn't give a name. Maybe they were just a concerned citizen who had seen the case online or on TV. They described the woman as being in her early 50s, the right age for Melissa, and said there was something about her face, the eyes and smile, that looked like the pictures of what Melissa might look like grown up. The tip was deemed credible enough to pass along. When Fort Worth authorities relayed this tip to the Highsmith family, a jolt of cautious excitement ran through them. After years of false leads, they had learned not to get too hopeful, but something about this one felt tangible. Charleston was far from Fort Worth, but not impossibly so. The description seemed to line up reasonably well. As one of Melissa's siblings later said, "We'd heard so many rumors over the years, but something about this one felt different. It sounded plausible." Without wasting time, the family pooled money and bought plane tickets. Within days, a small delegation of Highsmiths was on the ground in South Carolina, hearts pounding with anticipation. They carried flyers bearing images of Melissa as a baby and the latest composite of her as an adult. Stepping into an unfamiliar city, they hit the streets, handing out these flyers to passers-by and taping them to lampposts, bulletin boards, anywhere they might be noticed. They spoke with local shopkeepers and knocked on doors in the neighborhood mentioned by the tipster. It didn't take long for the local media to catch wind of the activity. Soon, cameras were rolling and reporters were interviewing the family on Charleston sidewalks. The story of the Texas family in search of their long-lost daughter made the evening news there, with Chirons asking, "Could missing Fort Worth girl be living in Charleston?" For a brief moment, hope blossomed. Strangers in Charleston joined the search, keeping an eye out for any woman who might fit the description. The Highsmiths themselves may have had a sleepless night or two, imagining finally meeting Melissa after all these years. But reality intervened quickly. Within a week, the family was able to arrange a DNA test with the South Carolina woman in question. Reports later indicated she willingly provided a sample once she learned of the situation. The results came back, unequivocal and cruel. She was not Melissa Highsmith. The resemblance had been just that, a coincidence. The Highsmith family's optimism crumbled yet again under the weight of a laboratory report. They thanked the woman in Charleston for her cooperation and, carrying heavy hearts, prepared to head back to Texas. It was another crushing blow, one of so many they had endured. Ordinarily, they would have returned home to regroup, waiting for the next tip and trying to summon the strength to hope once more. But this time was different. This false lead, disappointing as it was, sparked a revelation that would change everything. The trip to South Carolina did something for the family's mindset. It demonstrated just how far technology and media had come and how powerful they could be in galvanizing a search, even one 51 years cold. Here they were, across the country, following a trail that began with an anonymous phone tip, possibly prompted by an online post. They realized that while traditional police work had hit a wall decades ago, science and technology had leapt forward. Perhaps there were tools available now that hadn't been when they first searched for Melissa, tools that the police hadn't utilized for this case, but that the family could. One of Alta and Jeffrey's friends was an amateur genetic genealogist, someone who enjoyed helping people find unknown relatives through consumer DNA tests. In late October 2022, as the sting of the Charleston disappointment still lingered, this friend posed a question to Jeffrey Highsmith. "You've tried everything else. Why not submit your DNA to one of those ancestry services?" Jeffrey had certainly heard of popular DNA testing kits like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. Millions of people were using them by then to learn about their ethnic heritage or to find long-lost relatives. However, it hadn't occurred to him that such a service could be the key to finding Melissa. For years, the family assumed that DNA testing was strictly the domain of law enforcement or specialized labs. They had given their samples to official channels with no luck. The idea that a simple at-home test, marketed for curious family historians, could succeed where the FBI had failed seemed almost too good to be true. But the friend persisted. These databases had grown enormous, often connecting distant cousins and uncovering hidden family connections. If Melissa or her children had ever taken a DNA test, or if any blood relatives on her unknown side of the family had, Jeffrey's DNA might hit a match. Even if the odds were slim, wasn't it worth a try? It was easy and relatively cheap. What did they have to lose? Jeffrey agreed. In the first week of November 2022, he ordered a DNA kit from one of the major consumer companies. Later reports indicated it was 23andMe. When the kit arrived, he followed the simple instructions. He spit into the provided plastic tube, sealed it, and mailed it to the company's lab. The family tried not to get ahead of themselves with anticipation. They knew it typically took a few weeks to process and upload results. There was only a faint glimmer of hope that anything useful would come of it. After all, the vast majority of people in those databases were looking for ancestors, not missing persons. But as they said to each other at the time, even a 1% chance is better than 0%. On November 22, 2022, about 3 weeks after submitting the sample, Jeffrey received an email notification from the DNA company. At first glance, it looked routine, something about his results being ready to view. He logged into his account expecting to see a breakdown of his heritage, perhaps a pie chart of percentages from various regions, and a list of distant relatives the service had matched him with. What he saw instead made his heart pound and his hands shake. At the top of the page was a prominent alert. DNA match found. Immediate family. Parent. Child. Jeffrey's initial reaction was confusion. Was the site saying it found his child's DNA? That would mean Melissa. But he soon realized it wasn't a direct match with Melissa's DNA, but something just as telling. The system had detected profiles of 3 individuals whose DNA indicated they were extremely closely related to Jeffrey, so close, in fact, that the only plausible relationship was grandparent and grandchild. In other words, these 3 were the children of one of Jeffrey's own children. Jeffrey reread that line multiple times, hardly daring to believe what it implied. If he had 3 unknown grandchildren in the database, their mother could very well be Melissa. His heart racing, Jeffrey called one of his other daughters, Melissa's younger sister, who helped manage the Facebook page and much of the family's outreach. He sent her screenshots of the matches. They cross-referenced the usernames attached to these 3 profiles. Often in these databases, a person can choose to use their real name or a username. Luckily, these profiles appeared to have real first names listed. The siblings looked at each other in astonishment. Could it really be this straightforward? Melissa had children. Their long-lost sister might have a family of her own, and those children had used a consumer DNA service, unknowingly lighting a beacon that had drawn their grandfather right to them. The next step was to verify and connect the dots. The DNA company, due to privacy rules, wouldn't release personal details of the matches to Jeffrey directly. He couldn't see, for example, addresses or full names, only what the users had chosen to share. So Jeffrey utilized the service's built-in messaging system. He drafted a careful, heartfelt note to the account associated with these 3 profiles, likely one of the siblings managing a family account. In it, he explained that he had gotten a match indicating he was closely related and that he believed this could be his missing daughter's family. He provided contact information and asked them to get in touch if they were open to talking. While awaiting a response, the Highsmiths sought the help of a professional genealogist named Lisa Jo Shealy, who had volunteered with families of missing persons before. Lisa Jo had access to public genealogical databases and expertise in interpreting DNA results. She examined the raw data from Jeffrey's matches and quickly confirmed its significance. "There's no mistake here," she told the family. The probability that these matches were unrelated was effectively 0. The DNA segments they shared with Jeffrey were so long and numerous that only immediate family could share them. In fact, she mapped out a possible family tree based on the centimorgans, a unit of genetic linkage, and established that the simplest explanation was the correct one. These three individuals were the grandchildren of Jeffrey Highsmith. Lisa Jo and the family then switched from genetic analysis to old-fashioned detective work, using public records and social media to find a woman who fit what they now knew. The DNA matches provided first names and some approximate ages for Jeffrey's newfound grandchildren. Armed with those, they searched Facebook, public marriage and birth records, and anything else they could find. It wasn't long before they identified a likely candidate for the mystery mother, a woman named Melanie, living right back in Fort Worth, Texas. The coincidences started piling up almost eerily. The woman's full name was listed as Melanie Walden. She was in her early 50s, the right age to be Melissa. Her birth year was 1970, nearly the same as Melissa's 1969 birth year. Furthermore, it appeared that Melanie didn't have a traditional birth record. No hospital listed, and official documents only created a few years after Melissa's abduction. This suggested she might not have been born in a hospital under that name, which fit the profile of a child possibly taken and renamed. And of course, Melanie Walden had 3 adult children, the very ones whose DNA had matched Jeffrey's. One piece of evidence virtually sealed it. The Highsmiths found old photos of Melanie on social media, perhaps through a relative's postings. In one picture, a younger Melanie smiled at the camera, and there, just under her left eye, was a small, faint birthmark. Alta gasped when she saw it. Melissa had been born with a tiny birthmark in the very same spot. It was visible in some of her baby photos. Staring at that image, Alta and her family felt the distance between theory and reality collapse. This had to be Melissa. Even with all signs pointing to yes, the Highsmiths had been disappointed too many times to proceed without caution. They needed to contact Melanie directly, but delicately, respectfully. If she truly was Melissa, she had lived her whole life under another identity. How would she react to learning such shocking news out of the blue? If she wasn't Melissa, they didn't want to cause her unnecessary alarm or pain. The task of reaching out fell to Jeffrey. After all, if this was his daughter, it was a father's place to approach her. Jeffrey composed a message over Facebook Messenger, careful with each word. "Hi, my name is Jeffrey Highsmith," he began. "I have reason to believe I may be your biological father. I've been searching for my daughter named Melissa for 51 years. Do you have any information that could help me?" It was a short message, but loaded with an astonishing claim. He pressed send, and the family held their breath. On the other end, Melanie Walden saw a strange message pop up in her Facebook inbox. She did not recognize the sender's name. When she read the contents, her immediate reaction was skepticism. Could this be some kind of scam or cruel joke? She had grown up as Melanie, with parents she thought were her biological family, though her upbringing had been far from ordinary, as would later be revealed. Now, approaching 53 years old, to have someone suddenly say they were her real father was beyond anything she'd ever expected. It felt surreal, like something that happens in movies or on talk shows, not in real life. Melanie chose to ignore the message at first. Perhaps she showed it to her husband with a dismissive laugh, saying something like, "Can you believe the nerve of some people on the internet?" She had no memory of being Melissa Highsmith. How could she? She was only 21 months old when abducted. To her, this claim likely seemed unfounded and random, but the seed of curiosity was planted, if only because Jeffrey had mentioned a 51-year search and a very specific name, Melissa. It wasn't long before Melanie's husband took it upon himself to dig a little deeper. While Melanie went about her routine, he went online and Googled Melissa Highsmith. What he found stopped him cold. He discovered the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, and perhaps other articles or posts about the decades-old missing child case. As he scrolled through photos on the Facebook page, he came across a particular image, the original childhood photo of baby Melissa that had been circulated in newspapers in 1971. In that photo, the toddler wore a white dress and had a slight smile. He stared at it, feeling a strange familiarity. He called Melanie over, silently turning his computer screen toward her. Side by side, they compared that old black-and-white photo of baby Melissa with Melanie's own baby pictures, which were in a family album they retrieved from a shelf. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the lips, the little birthmark under the left eye, feature after feature lined up eerily well. Melanie's skepticism gave way to shock. She found herself speechless, her mind racing back over her childhood memories, looking for anything that could confirm or refute this possibility. Could she really be this missing girl from Texas? She had lived her entire life as someone else. There had always been some puzzling pieces in her past, things she couldn't quite explain. But she had never in her wildest dreams thought the explanation might be that she was abducted as a baby. With trembling hands, Melanie opened Facebook and wrote back to Jeffrey. Her tone was measured and cautious. "I don't know what to think of all this," she admitted, "but I saw the pictures. I have to admit there are similarities. I'm willing to talk and maybe do a DNA test." That message set off a flurry of communications that quickly bridged a 51-year chasm. Melanie, for now still calling herself that, agreed to speak by phone or Zoom with some of the Highsmith family and with the genealogist Lisa Jo. They compared notes about her early childhood, and every detail Melanie provided only made the Highsmiths more convinced. Still, everyone involved wanted scientific proof beyond any doubt. With guidance from Lisa Jo, they arranged for an independent, accredited lab to conduct a formal DNA test, comparing Melanie's DNA with samples from Jeffrey and Alta. This would be more direct than the 23andMe data, confirming parentage to a legal standard. The process was handled quietly. They sent cheek swabs or saliva kits to Melanie with careful instructions, possibly under an alias to maintain privacy. The family did not inform the media or even law enforcement yet. They couldn't bear another public disappointment. For those few days waiting on the definitive lab results, the Highsmith family walked on eggshells. They knew in their hearts it was her, but after so many false starts, they needed to see it in writing. Alta, now in her 70s, was finally told about this promising development, if she hadn't been looped in already. One can only imagine the emotional guardedness of a mother who has dreamed of this moment for half a century. "I've had my hopes raised before," Alta said softly. "If this is really her, I'll know when I see her face to face." Alta braced herself for what could be the ultimate joy, or yet another cruel heartbreak. The results came back just before Thanksgiving, one of America's most family-centered holidays, a day of gratitude, reunion, and reflection. The lab report could not have been clearer, a 99.9997% probability that Melanie Walden was the biological daughter of Jeffrey Highsmith and Alta Apantenko. In layman's terms, it was a positive match, as positive as science can state. Melissa Highsmith, abducted as a toddler in 1971, had been found alive in 2022. After 51 years, the longest of searches had finally come to an end. For a moment, the world stood still for the Highsmith family. It was real. The little girl they had chased across decades and countless miles was alive, right there in Fort Worth, the very city where she'd been taken. She had grown into a woman with a life of her own, never knowing her true identity. The mixture of emotions was overwhelming: joy, disbelief, relief, and even the bittersweet lament of lost time. There was so much to catch up on, so many years that could never be reclaimed, yet the gratitude of this second chance was immeasurable. They immediately made plans to meet. Fittingly, they chose Thanksgiving Day 2022 for the reunion, a day that symbolized the restoration of family. The gathering took place at a relative's home in the Fort Worth area, a comfortable setting away from prying media, while they confirmed the news amongst themselves. For Alta, the thought of finally hugging her daughter again was almost too much to bear. For Melissa, still answering to Melanie at that moment, walking into a home full of strangers who were her blood relations was equally overwhelming. When the door opened and Melissa stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. Dozens of eyes were on her, but she was looking for one face, her mother's. Alta stood up slowly, heart pounding in her chest. No introduction was needed. Across the room, Alta and Melissa's eyes met, And in that instant, 5 decades evaporated. Alta moved forward as if in a dream. "That's my baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mother and daughter fell into each other's arms, holding on tightly as if they would never let go again. It was the hug they had both imagined 1,000,000 times in their dreams, now finally real. There were no words adequate for that moment. They simply held each other, Alta stroking her daughter's hair and face, feeling the reality of a miracle in her arms. Jeffrey joined, wrapping them both in a hug, his voice caught in his throat as he kept saying, 51 years, 51 years, almost like a mantra of wonderment. Melissa's siblings were there too, eyes wet with tears of joy, as they embraced the sister they knew only from stories and photographs. 3 generations of family, including Melissa's own children, stood together that day, sharing smiles and tears in a scene that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Photos from that Thanksgiving reunion show an astonishing tableau. Alta and Jeffrey flanking Melissa, all 3 of them radiant with the kind of joy that only the rarest reunion can bring. There were smiles as bright as the afternoon sun, and faces red from crying tears of happiness. Few dry eyes were in that house as relatives introduced themselves to Melissa, each one marveling at this living answer to their prayers. It was as if time itself had bent to let this meeting happen. 2 days later, on November 26, 2022, the Highsmiths decided to go public with the news. They organized a gathering at a local church where they often held prayer vigils for Melissa in the past. Now it would be a place of celebration. Word had leaked out to some local media by then that a major break had occurred in the Melissa Highsmith case. When Alta, Jeffrey, and Melissa walked into the church hall together, the room erupted in applause and gasps. For reporters and community members who had followed this story for years, it was like seeing a ghost brought to life. Alta addressed the crowd and cameras, her voice quavering with emotion. "I always hoped for this day," she said. "I thought I would never see her again, but here she is." She reached for Melissa's hand as she spoke, almost as if needing to physically touch her to believe it. Jeffrey, typically a man of fewer words, was choked up and kept shaking his head in amazement. 51 years, he managed to say in front of the microphones. 51 years. He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone understood. An entire lifetime had passed, and yet here they stood as a family reunited. Melissa, still adjusting to the whirlwind of the previous few days, also spoke to the media. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "My heart is full, and yes, it's a little broken at the same time. But I'm very, very happy." She expressed gratitude for being found and for the family that never stopped looking for her. One can only imagine the complicated swirl of feelings inside her, joy at finding her parents and siblings, confusion as she reconciled her 2 identities, and the sorrow of realizing just how much had been taken from her by her abductor. Yet, on that day, happiness prevailed. She was beaming, arm in arm with her mother, as cameras flashed. News of the discovery spread nationwide and even internationally. Major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post picked up the story. TV programs and morning shows talked about the Highsmith case as a Thanksgiving miracle. In an era of cynical headlines, this real-life story felt almost too good to be true. A child missing for over half a century had been found alive and reunited with her family. Many outlets highlighted the role of modern technology, calling it a DNA triumph, or noting how DNA sleuthing cracked a case that old-fashioned detective work could not. Social media buzzed with the hashtag #DNowins, the phrase that the Highsmiths themselves had used in their celebratory posts. People were sharing the story as a beacon of hope, proof that one should never give up on a missing loved one. For those directly involved, the celebration was also a vindication of perseverance. Journalists interviewing the Highsmiths after the reunion noted that while the DNA discovery might seem sudden, it was actually the culmination of 5 decades of unwavering determination. Technology had provided the key, but the Highsmiths' relentless love had been the force turning that key all along. Lisa Jo Sheila, the genetic genealogist who assisted, emphasized this in interviews. "This isn't a case of the police solving it, or some lucky break at a traffic stop," she said. "It was solved by a father who uploaded his DNA and a family who never gave up. It's a new kind of investigation." Indeed, it signaled a changing era, when citizen sleuths armed with consumer DNA kits could accomplish what had once been impossible. As Lisa Jo eloquently put it, a father spits in a vial, and a mystery older than the internet itself is solved in a matter of weeks. It was a remarkable collision of old grief and new science. In the aftermath, the Fort Worth Police Department arranged their own confirmation tests through official channels. By early May 2023, they released a statement that formally closed the case of Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The individual, known as Melanie Walden, has been confirmed through DNA analysis as Melissa Suzanne Highsmith, who was reported missing in 1971, the press release read. This case represents one of the longest missing child recoveries in American history. For a department that had carried the weight of this unsolved case for so long, it was a historic moment. Detectives, past and present, expressed relief and astonishment. Many had assumed that if answers ever came, they would come in the form of remains found or a deathbed confession, not a living person found well into middle age. With the confirmation official, the Highsmiths turned their focus to what truly mattered, making up for lost time. Alta and Jeffrey faced the delicate and joyful task of getting to know their daughter as an adult. They had missed her entire childhood, her teenage years, all the milestones of her life thus far. Now they had a second chance, and they approached it with both excitement and the understanding that it would take time to build their relationship. They would have to navigate the awkwardness of being strangers in one sense, yet deeply connected in another. There were decades of experiences to catch up on, stories to share from both sides. For Alta, this reunion was the answer to countless prayers. It marked the end of lying awake at night wondering if Melissa was safe, of imagining her little girl's face aging through the years. "People always told me to move on, to let it go," Alta reflected in one interview. "But how could a mother move on when she never knew what happened to her child? I just couldn't, and I'm glad I didn't." There was no mistaking the quiet vindication and immense gratitude in her voice. She had held on to hope with ferocity, and hope had finally delivered. Jeffrey echoed similar sentiments. At times over the years, he had channeled his pain into action, scouring records, following tips, even submitting that fateful DNA sample. To see it pay off was enormously validating. 51 years of searching, he told a reporter, shaking his head in wonder, and it took one little piece of DNA to bring her back to us. He expressed no bitterness in that statement, just amazement at how the breakthrough had finally come. All those nights he spent scrolling through missing person databases or sifting through online forums, every road trip to investigate a lead, every DNA sample he'd ever given, it had all been worth it for this moment. And what about Melissa herself? A woman who had lived an entire lifetime under a different name, unaware that she was missing. For her, the reunion was both a joyous ending and a bewildering beginning. On one hand, she finally had answers to questions about her past that had long nagged at her. On the other hand, those answers upended the very foundation of her identity. "I finally know who I am," she said poignantly. She spoke of feeling an incredible sense of peace and fulfillment upon reuniting with her birth parents. It was as if something deep inside her that had always felt off was finally realigned. But alongside that peace was turmoil. She had discovered that her entire life story, her name, her origins, were based on a lie told by her kidnapper. Melissa's journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As joyous as the reunion was, she and her family would have to come to terms with all that had been lost and all that had been miraculously regained. The official case file may have been marked "located," "case closed," but the emotional and psychological chapters were still being written. At the center of it all, however, stood one undeniable truth. Science had finally caught up with faith. That single email subject line, "match found," had rewritten a family's history and proved that even after half a century, impossible was not truly impossible. In the days and weeks after the initial euphoria of the reunion, Melissa Highsmith began to grapple with the profound implications of her rediscovered identity. She had lived for 51 years under the name Melanie Walden, believing she was born to the woman who raised her. Now, piece by piece, she started to assemble the jigsaw puzzle of her past, and as she did, long-buried memories and strange inconsistencies from her childhood took on new, startling meaning. Melissa's life story, as she knew it, had always been unusual. She remembered growing up under the care of a woman who was extremely secretive and controlling. In interviews, Melissa later described how, as a little girl, she was often kept indoors, isolated from other children, and subjected to intense rules. Neighbors seldom saw young Melanie playing outside, and she rarely, if ever, had friends over. This woman, the one who had called herself her mother, maintained an iron grip on Melissa's life. If Melissa ever questioned why she couldn't do the things other kids did, like ride her bike down the street or attend a friend's birthday party, her supposed mother always had an answer ready. "You were born at home," the woman would tell her, "and you have brain damage. The world out there is dangerous for you." This was a lie, one carefully crafted to instill fear and dependency. To a child, it sounded authoritative and unchallengeable. If you're told from your earliest memory that you're fragile or unwell, you accept it as truth, and it explained, in a twisted way, why her mother sheltered her so aggressively. Looking back with the knowledge she had now, Melissa understood that none of it had been normal or nurturing parental behavior. It had been the tactics of a criminal covering her tracks. The woman she'd known as Mom was, in reality, her abductor, the same person who had likely stood on Alta's doorstep in white gloves and taken her away. The extreme secrecy, the refusal to let Melissa interact freely with the outside world, even the fabricated story of a home birth and medical issues, all were designed to hide a crime. The kidnapper's goal was to keep Melissa invisible, a ghost in society, so that no curious teacher, doctor, or neighbor would start asking the kinds of questions that could unravel her lies. As Melissa recounted to her newfound family and reporters, affection in her childhood home was scarce and conditional. The woman could be caring one moment and cruel the next. Physical punishment was not uncommon, and emotional manipulation was constant. Melissa grew up walking on eggshells, learning that being quiet and compliant was the safest way to exist. Silence was safety, she said of her upbringing. If she made herself small and unnoticeable, she could avoid angering the woman who raised her. It was a child's strategy for survival in a world that didn't feel quite right. Deep down, young Melissa had an inexplicable feeling that she didn't belong. "I thought I was born to the wrong person," she once said, describing an unshakable sense of dissonance she carried even as a child. Of course, she had no context to understand why she felt that way. She couldn't articulate it as a little girl. It was just a subtle, persistent ache, like a word at the tip of your tongue that you can't remember. Now, as an adult uncovering the truth, she realized that feeling was the only fragment of her psyche that remembered, in some way that her life had been stolen. As Melissa entered her teenage years, the strict confines of her upbringing grew more suffocating. By age 15, she reached a breaking point. Teenage rebellion for her wasn't sneaking out to a party or talking back. It was running away outright. One day, she decided she couldn't endure it any longer. Without a clear plan or anywhere to go, she fled that house at 15, preferring the uncertainties of the streets to the oppressive certainty of life with her captor. Running away began another tumultuous chapter in Melissa's life. She found herself drifting through precarious situations, just a teenager trying to survive on her own. She slept in shelters or on couches when she could, and sometimes on the streets when she couldn't. In order to eat and find a roof over her head, she took whatever work or help came her way, some of it likely unsavory. "Sometimes I did what I had to do to get by," she later admitted, implying she endured hardships and made choices that no person that age should have to face. By the time she was 19, Melissa had 3 children of her own. Those years were a blur of instability, young love or lust, pregnancies, and struggling to be a mother when she herself had never had a stable example of one. By 20, she lost custody of all 3 children. Perhaps it was due to her precarious living conditions or involvement with the wrong crowd, or simply not having the means to provide a safe home. The specifics are private, but the pattern is painfully clear. A cycle of loss and trauma echoing the original tragedy of her own childhood. It's heart-wrenching to realize that Melissa's early adulthood, the chaos, the instability, the loss of her children, was a direct ripple from the initial abduction. A stolen child often becomes a broken adult through no fault of their own. Melissa's life seemed to mirror that truth. The very foundation of her world had been built on lies and control. So when she broke free, she had nothing solid to stand on. The skills most young adults learn from their families, how to navigate society, how to form healthy relationships, Melissa had to figure out on her own, and she stumbled frequently. In later interviews, after reuniting with the Highsmiths, Melissa did not shy away from acknowledging her rocky past. She felt it was important for people to understand the full scope of what had been taken from her, not just her family, but her sense of self and the normal progression of life milestones. "I used to wonder why she even kept me if she didn't want me," Melissa said of her abductor. "I just thought I was a burden." Those words reveal the heartbreaking mindset of a child who grew up feeling unloved. To Melissa, it had seemed like her mother didn't truly want her around, yet wouldn't let her go, a painful paradox that made sense only once she learned the truth. After she left home at 15, Melissa did not maintain a relationship with the woman who raised her. They became estranged, with only occasional or no contact. Details suggest they were long estranged by the time Melissa was in her 40s. Melissa likely harbored anger and resentment, even if she couldn't fully articulate why she felt so hurt beyond the obvious abuse. It wasn't until November 2022, when DNA confirmed her true identity, that the full picture snapped into focus. Armed with undeniable proof of who she really was, Melissa decided to confront her past directly. The woman who had raised her was still alive in late 2022. In the flurry of the discovery and reunion, law enforcement intended to question this woman. After all, she was the prime suspect who had eluded justice for 51 years, but Melissa wanted answers for herself, not just for the police. She initiated contact, likely through a message or letter. Given their estrangement, it might have been easier to write than to call. She asked the burning question that had taken shape in her soul. "Who am I, really?" The response she received was both shocking and frustratingly incomplete. The woman admitted that she had known, at least on some level, who Melissa was. "I knew you were that baby," the woman wrote back, referring to the high-profile missing child case from Fort Worth in 1971. Imagine Melissa reading those words, realizing that her captor had seen the news reports or flyers with her toddler face on them and still chose to keep her hidden. The kidnapper essentially confessed to being aware all along that she had someone else's child. When pressed for details, however, the woman spun a story that raised more questions than answers. She claimed that back in late 1971 or 1972, she had purchased Melissa for $500 from another woman who told her that the child's mother couldn't afford to keep her. In this version, she tried to paint the abduction as a sort of under-the-table adoption, an act of charity even, rather than a kidnapping. She insisted it wasn't a violent snatching, but a private arrangement, implying that she gave the child a home when the birth mother could not. Melissa's reaction to this tale was one of deep skepticism and anger. "In my heart, I don't believe her," Melissa said later. "I think she took me, not bought me." Indeed, the kidnapper's story had glaring holes. If it were true, why the elaborate disguise on the day of the abduction? Why the fake name, Ruth Johnson? Why hide and lie for decades rather than come forward once she realized the child was actively being sought? Nothing about the $500 story fit the evidence that had haunted the case. The white gloves, the bonnet, the methodical erasure of her identity. Unfortunately, before police could formally interrogate the woman, she died. The kidnapper passed away in late 2022, taking with her any further secrets or clarifications she might have offered, if any. Investigators, reviewing the case after the fact, publicly doubted the veracity of the claim that Melissa was bought. There was no evidence of any such transaction or any witness to corroborate that narrative. It seemed more likely to be an attempt by the woman to rationalize or minimize her actions, to cast herself not as a kidnapper, but as someone who rescued a child from a bad situation, a narrative utterly contradicted by the suffering Melissa endured. For Melissa, hearing that half-truth and losing the chance to press further was difficult. She would never get the full, unvarnished admission from her abductor, nor any apology. The woman had avoided accountability to the end. In a way, Melissa had been robbed of justice in addition to everything else. However, the revelations she did get were still powerful enough to bring a kind of closure to her internal questions. She finally understood the why behind her bizarre childhood. "I understand now why I was kept away from people," Melissa reflected. "If anyone had looked too closely, they would have known I didn't belong there." This realization was validating. All the odd restrictions, the lack of school pictures or doctor's visits, if any, the avoidance of neighbors, it wasn't because something was wrong with her, as she had been led to believe. It was because something was wrong with what had been done to her. She had been a missing puzzle piece, forcibly jammed into a place she didn't fit, and the person responsible made sure no one got a clear enough view to notice. Though the truth set her free in a very real sense, it also imposed a heavy psychological burden. Melissa struggled with complex emotions following the reunion. Joy and gratitude were tempered by confusion and anger. She had a loving family, the Highsmiths, who had found her and welcomed her back with open arms. But she didn't share memories with them, and she had to learn how to be a daughter and a sister after a lifetime of not knowing them. Meanwhile, the memories she did have were mostly of the woman who had stolen her. Imagine reconciling affection for someone who raised you and likely had moments of kindness or motherly care, as abusers can sometimes have, with the hatred or betrayal you feel knowing that person was your kidnapper. It's a psychological tightrope. "It's like I lived someone else's life," Melissa explained, "and now I have to learn mine." The person she had been, Melanie, was in many ways a fabrication. Now she had to build an identity as Melissa, which was her true self, but also a new self to her because she had no personal memories of being Melissa Highsmith. The melding of those two selves, the abducted child and the found woman, would require time and likely therapy. Experts in psychology, especially those familiar with long-term abduction cases, liken this experience to a form of living amnesia. It's not that Melissa forgot who she was never allowed to know. Her memories were real, but the context was false. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a renowned memory researcher cited by Competitor Script, has noted that in such cases, victims adapt to a false reality so completely that it becomes their truth. Only when confronted with undeniable evidence do they realize their memories, though accurate, were built on a lie of origin. Melissa's past wasn't missing in her mind. It was just anchored to the wrong narrative. After November 2022, Melissa began the long process of healing and reclaiming her life. Therapy and counseling were critical. She had decades of trauma to sift through, abandonment issues, abuse, the loss of her own children, and now the shock of her true identity. It was a heavy load, but she did not have to carry it alone anymore. She had the support of her biological family, who were determined to help her in every way possible, and she also reconnected with her 3 adult children. Her kids, who had been raised largely apart from her, were stunned to learn the story behind their mother's early life. They now understood that the turmoil that had separated them from her was rooted in something that happened long before they were born. "Everything we thought we knew about our family changed overnight," Melissa told them. There were difficult conversations to be had, and forgiveness to seek and grant, but the revelations also opened the door to rebuilding those relationships on truthful ground. One of the most empowering steps Melissa took was to legally reclaim her name. In May 2023, in a courtroom in Tarrant County, Texas, she stood with Alta and Jeffrey by her side to petition for a name change, from Melanie to her birth name, Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The hearing was likely a brief formality for the judge, but an emotionally charged milestone for the family. Reporters and relatives gathered to witness it. When the judge signed the order granting the name change, the courtroom erupted in applause. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. It's not every day you see someone get their stolen identity restored after half a century. For Melissa, adopting her true name was a profound symbol of reclaiming her life's narrative. "It's a restoration of truth," she said of the name change. No longer would she carry the name given by a kidnapper. She would carry the name her parents gave her, a name that was rightfully hers. Of course, a new name and a family reunion didn't simply erase the scars of the past. Melissa was realistic about that. The emotional scars remained, and some would likely stay with her forever. But now she had a chance to face them with the support and love that had been missing from her life for so long. She expressed a quiet anger that lingered beneath her otherwise positive outlook. It wasn't an all-consuming rage, but a steady resentment for how easily the abductor had gotten away with it, and for how society in 1971 had lacked the means to stop it. "I grew up just a few miles away from my real family," she said. "All that time we were so close. How could no one see?" It's a haunting question, one that doesn't have a satisfying answer. It underlines how tragically simple it was in that era for someone to abduct a child and create a whole new life to hide behind. Paper records were easily forged or created anew. People moved without a trace. Communication between jurisdictions was slow or non-existent. Indeed, Melissa's life story highlights a stark contrast between two eras. In 1971, a woman could brazenly walk off with someone's child and vanish without a trace. In 2022, a few clicks on a computer and a DNA sample could unravel 51 years of secrecy. Melissa herself noted this irony. "DNA solved what human systems couldn't," she said. She often repeated the phrase that had gone viral with her story. DNA won. But she would add, "It just took 51 years to find me." It's a bittersweet acknowledgement that while modern science finally delivered justice and truth, it did so on a timeline that no one could have imagined at the outset. As Melissa reclaimed her life, she chose not to hide her past, but to own it and share it in hopes of helping others. She became open about her experiences and was willing to speak about the trauma of long-term abduction, the complexities of identity, and the resilience she found in survival. With her family's support, she began charting a path forward as Melissa Highsmith, a name that now symbolized not a missing child, but a found woman. The incredible resolution of Melissa Highsmith's case could have ended with a simple happy reunion and fading headlines, but the Highsmith family was determined that their story would not conclude there. They saw a larger purpose emerging from their personal miracle, to spread hope to others and to revolutionize how cold cases could be tackled by everyday people. Thus, the Highsmiths turned their energy outward, transforming from a family defined by a missing person into outspoken advocates for the missing. In interviews and public statements soon after Melissa's return, Jeffrey, Alta, and Melissa's siblings found themselves repeating a powerful mantra that had guided them through the darkest times. Never give up. Follow every lead. Believe in science. Believe in family. This wasn't just a slogan. It was the distillation of 51 years of lived experience. Those words struck a chord with many, and the family noticed that people were listening. They retooled the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, which had accomplished its primary goal, into a broader platform. It was no longer just about locating Melissa. It became about helping other families find their missing loved ones. They renamed it, or subtitled it, in a way that indicated its new mission, perhaps something like Finding Melissa Highsmith and Helping Find Others. The Highsmith story was proof that even the longest longshot could come true, and many families of missing persons took heart from that. The page evolved into a kind of forum and resource center. Volunteers and amateur sleuths flocked there, sharing advice on how to use genealogical databases, how to upload raw DNA data from one service into public ones like GED Match, how to interpret a family tree match result. The Highsmiths, still flush with gratitude and energy, personally engaged with people who reached out. Melissa's siblings, now well versed in the intricacies of consumer DNA platforms, would spend time walking others through the steps that had worked for them. They couldn't solve every case, no one can, but they could empower and educate others to use the tools and techniques that had finally brought their sister home. Messages poured in from across the globe. Some were from parents of children who had gone missing years ago, wanting to know how to submit their DNA in hopes of a hit. Others were from adoptees who suspected they might have been abducted or who simply craved to know their biological roots. Even people curious about family mysteries that were less dire sought advice. The Highsmiths responded to as many as they possibly could. "We can't solve every case," Melissa herself posted, "but we can help people understand the tools that might." It was a humble and sincere offer. They weren't claiming to have all the answers, but they wanted to share what they'd learned through their ordeal. What had begun as one family's personal tragedy and triumph was quickly becoming a grassroots movement. The Highsmiths' Facebook community morphed into a support network. There, people shared not only their thanks and congratulations, but their own stories of loss and longing, their own hopes and uncertainties. Each success story that emerged, however small, like finding a distant cousin or confirming a relative's identity, was celebrated by the group, and each new inquiry was met with encouragement. A particularly poignant comment appeared under a photo of the reunited Highsmith family that was posted on the page. "Your story gave me the courage to test my DNA," one user wrote. "Thank you for showing us it's not too late." This sentiment was echoed by dozens of others. Many had been sitting with unanswered questions for years, but felt recharged by the Highsmith miracle. The media's fascination with Melissa's story also had beneficial side effects for awareness. In the weeks following the reunion, it seemed every major media outlet wanted to cover the tale from their unique angle. CNN, The New York Times, People magazine, BBC News, and countless local stations ran pieces. Each emphasized a slightly different point. CNN called it a triumph of determination and DNA, highlighting how technology and tenacity together cracked the case. The New York Times wrote about it as one of the longest-running missing child cases ever solved by consumer DNA, putting it in the context of a broader technological shift. The Washington Post famously dubbed it a Thanksgiving miracle rooted in data, a phrase that underscored how this traditional family holiday had been made special by something very modern. As these stories spread, so did discussions about the implications. People began talking about how police departments handle cold cases and whether they should integrate consumer DNA resources more proactively. Many observers pointed out that the Highsmith case was solved not by law enforcement per se, but by a family's use of open-to-the-public tools. That sparked debate. If ordinary citizens could do this, why hadn't the police done it earlier? The conversation inevitably turned toward privacy concerns versus the public good. Some civil libertarians cautioned that widespread use of genealogy databases in criminal cases could infringe on privacy rights. But families of victims and missing persons argued that when a life or justice is at stake, these tools are invaluable. The Highsmith case, being such a feel-good story, added positive weight to the side of encouraging DNA sharing for investigative purposes. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies took note, too. At a 2023 Forensic Science Conference, a group of investigators and genetic experts discussed the Highsmith case as a game-changer. They used it as a case study on how open-source DNA databases and family-led initiatives can solve cases previously deemed unsolvable. There was talk of more police departments setting up special units trained in genetic genealogy, or at least partnering with civilian genealogists who have the know-how. Some progressive departments launched pilot programs to review old missing persons cases through the lens of genealogical DNA. They quietly invited families to submit DNA to services like 23andMe or Ancestry, if they hadn't already, and then let specialized analysts work on any promising matches that came up. This kind of collaboration, unthinkable a decade earlier, was gaining acceptance. In essence, the Highsmiths had shown that families aren't just victims or witnesses, they can be active investigators with the right tools. The National Center for Missing Exploited Children, NCMEC, which had taken that Charleston tip in 2022, also responded to this shifting landscape. By late 2023, NCMEC announced a new initiative to collaborate with private DNA companies and genealogists to assist in long-term missing cases. They openly cited Melissa Highsmith's recovery as a catalyst for this change. A spokesperson for NCMEC said, "It changed how we think about old cases. Families aren't just waiting anymore, they're investigating." This was a huge paradigm shift in the field of missing persons. The synergy between faith and technology was a theme the Highsmiths often came back to. They saw no contradiction in crediting both divine providence and science for bringing Melissa home. Alta, deeply spiritual, believed her prayers had been answered, but she also deeply respected the tool, DNA, that delivered that answer. Jeffrey talked about miracles and data in the same breath. In a world where sometimes people pit faith against science, the Highsmiths stood as living proof that the two can work hand in hand. By the end of 2023, the ripple effect of their story was evident in tangible results beyond their own family. It was reported that through the advice and network fostered by the Highsmiths' advocacy, more than 30 families had found significant leads, or even full reunions using genetic tracing. Not all were as dramatic or heartwarming as Melissa's case. Each situation is unique, and outcomes vary. Some found out their missing loved one had died, but at least now they knew and could lay them to rest properly. Others reconnected with family members from whom they were separated by less nefarious circumstances, like adoptions or lost contact. But every connection made, every mystery solved, reinforced the Highsmiths' message. Even the coldest cases can thaw if you refuse to give up and leverage every available resource. In reflecting on their journey, Jeffrey offered a humble insight, tinged with both regret and wisdom. "For 51 years we were looking in all the wrong places," he said. "Now we tell people, look everywhere, but don't forget to look close to home too." It was an acknowledgement that in their desperate search across states and even abroad, they had at times considered international possibilities. They never imagined Melissa might have been in Fort Worth all along. It was a gentle caution to other families that sometimes the answers are nearer than you think. Alta, who by this time preferred to spend quiet moments with her daughter rather than the spotlight, still lent her voice occasionally to those seeking guidance. She would tell anyone who asked the simple truth she had lived: don't stop believing, and don't wait for someone else to find them. You can be the one. This statement was empowering. It told families that they had agency, that while law enforcement can help, there are avenues they themselves can pursue. If a 70-something mother with little formal investigative training could, through love and perseverance, help crack a 50-year case, then surely others could find the strength to keep searching too. The case of Melissa Highsmith stands as both an extraordinary miracle and a reflective mirror. A miracle because the odds of a kidnapped child being found alive after half a century are astronomically low, yet it happened, reminding the world that sometimes truth is stranger and more wonderful than fiction. A mirror because it forces us to look at how we as a society handle the lost and missing, and how advances in science can illuminate the failures and missed opportunities of the past. It shows us the importance of never losing hope, of adapting to new tools, and of the incredible things that can happen when a family's love refuses to fade. For the Highsmith family, their long nightmare finally transformed into a dream of second chances. They have had to rebuild and heal, but they're doing it together, something that for so long was only a fantasy. Their story has already begun inspiring books, and talk of a documentary film is in the air. Melissa's journey, her theft, survival, and rediscovery is a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of love. And now, as the Highsmiths continue to share their experience, they invite all of us to join in their mission of hope. If you believe in second chances, in the power of science, and in making sure stories like Melissa's are never forgotten, then please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps keep these important stories alive. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold Case Desk for more deep-dive true crime documentaries and miraculous reunions. By joining us, you become part of a community that knows it's never too late for the truth to emerge. Thank you for watching, and stay with us as we continue to shine a light on cold cases and the enduring hope that they can be solved.